The studio boss didn't knock. He didn't need to. He walked onto that set like he owned the air in the room, because in Hollywood, he did. Marlon Brando was already in costume, already half-turned into Don Vito Corleone. When the threat landed, one wrong move, one late call time, one headline that embarrassed the company, and the picture would keep rolling without him. Career over, reputation sealed, the kind of humiliation a man never outlives. The crew froze, waiting for the explosion. Brando had a history, the suits had their story about him, and this boss came to collect. But Brando didn't yell, he didn't beg, he didn't storm off, he smiled, like a man who'd just been handed the weapon he needed. Here is the story. Hollywood, early 1970s. The old studio system was dying, but it wasn't dead yet. You could still smell it in the corridors. Cigarette smoke trapped in carpet, stale coffee, paper contracts handled by men who never set foot on a soundstage unless it was to hurt somebody. The movies were changing. Audiences wanted grit, real faces, real pain, and the studios wanted control. Paramount was trying to survive the new era without losing its grip, and that meant one thing: no chaos, no loose cannons, no geniuses who couldn't be managed. Now drop into the middle of that pressure cooker, a film that already felt dangerous before a single frame was shot. A story about family, violence, loyalty, about men who smile while they decide your fate. And the director, Francis Ford Coppola, was young enough to be dismissed and hungry enough to fight back. Then there was Brando. Publicly, Marlon Brando was still a legend, this thunderbolt who changed acting forever. The face of rebellion, the man who made power look effortless. But privately, the industry had turned that legend into a warning label. Brando had clashed with studios, challenged authority, and become a financial risk in an era that punished risk with cruelty. Executives didn't talk about his talent first. They talked about budgets, schedules, insurance, control. And here's the contradiction that matters. The very thing that made Brando impossible to handle was the thing Coppola needed. Don Corleone couldn't feel like a performance. He had to feel like gravity, like a room turning cold when he entered. Brando could do that in a breath. Paramount didn't want him. They demanded proof. They demanded guarantees. They demanded safety rails around a man who hated being fenced in. Brando, the artist, being treated like a liability to be contained. This is where the tension starts to hum, because Brando agreed to conditions. He played along. He gave them what they wanted on paper. And within hours, everything would change, because the threat wasn't just about time cards and money. It was about humiliation, about whether Brando would kneel to a system that tried to break him. But here's what nobody knew. This is the turn. Brando didn't walk onto that set hoping to be accepted. He walked on prepared to win a war without firing a shot. And to understand how he pulled that off, we have to go back to the moment Paramount decided to treat Marlon Brando like a problem that needed a leash. Coppola's fight for Brando wasn't romantic. It was brutal. It was math. It was fear. Studio meetings where men in suits spoke about an actor the way you'd speak about a flood. Not as art, not as soul, just damage. So the demand came down. If Brando wanted the role, he had to prove himself. Not with a reputation, not with a legacy, with something tangible, a screen test, a promise of good behavior, the kind of requirement that would have insulted most stars into walking away. Brando didn't walk away. He turned the insult into an opening. He showed up and transformed himself. Hair darkened, face altered, voice lowered into something that sounded like velvet wrapped around a blade. It wasn't Brando playing a gangster. It was a man who felt ancient, deliberate, watchful. Brando made a case not with arguments, but with inevitability. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The studio could deny him, but they couldn't deny what the character needed. And still, Paramount held on to control the way a drowning man holds onto a rope. They wanted conditions. real ones: insurance, oversight, accountability, a promise that the production wouldn't become another headline. Brando read the room. He understood something the studio bosses didn't. Power isn't always the loudest voice. Sometimes power is letting the other man think he's steering. So Brando made himself smaller, on purpose. He took the meetings. He nodded. He signed what they put in front of him. He let them believe they'd tamed the storm. But the set is where control gets tested, because once cameras roll, the paper stops mattering. The truth is in the moment. And Brando's reputation had trained these executives to expect one of two things. Either he'd explode, or he'd collapse into indifference and sabotage the schedule with silence. Now shift for a second. Years earlier, before The Godfather ever existed as a gamble, Brando had spent his career watching studios chew people up. He saw how they rewarded obedience and punished dignity. He saw how they built stars and then blamed those stars when the machine got ugly. That kind of knowledge changes a man. It doesn't make him gentler, it makes him strategic. Back on the Paramount lot, the pressure wasn't just financial, it was personal. Coppola was fighting for legitimacy. The producers were fighting for the film's survival. And Brando was fighting for something quieter. Respect. Not applause, not headlines. Respect. The days leading into filming were thick with quiet rules. You could feel them. People speaking softer when a suit walked by, assistants watching clocks, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Everyone knew the studio was waiting for Brando to prove their fears right. And then the breaking point. It came early, when the studio boss decided to make an example out of him. Not in an office, not through polite memos. On the set, in front of people. A controlled humiliation, a reminder: we own this picture, we own the schedule, and if you cost us, you're gone. Quick question, because this is where the story stops being Hollywood and starts being human. Have you ever been trapped between dignity and survival? Between telling someone what they deserve to hear and knowing it would destroy your career if you said it out loud? Tell me in the comments, what did you choose? Because Brando had a choice in that moment. Blow up and confirm their story, or do something colder, something smarter. And the door opened. The set was tense in that way only film sets get. Too many people pretending they aren't nervous, lights hot, air heavy, crew moving like they're stepping around glass. And there, in the center of it, Brando, quiet, contained, already in the posture of Don Corleone. Not performing, becoming. Then the studio boss arrived. No introduction that mattered, just authority in motion. The kind of man who didn't have to raise his voice because everyone else lowered theirs for him. He didn't ask how the day was going. He didn't compliment the work. He went straight for the throat, straight for the leverage. The message was clean and cruel. Paramount had put conditions on Brando for a reason. The studio would not tolerate Brando problems. If the schedule slipped, if the production got embarrassed, if the actor decided he was bigger than the film, there were consequences. Real ones. The kind that don't end when the movie wraps. And Brando listened. He didn't fidget. He didn't argue. He didn't give the crew the explosion they expected. He just watched the man, eyes steady, like he was studying a new kind of animal. A long pause. Silence. Pure silence. Then Brando spoke, softly, calm, almost polite, and that softness did something strange. It made the threat feel smaller, like it had been swallowed by the room, because Brando didn't respond like an employee. He responded like a man who understood power better than the man threatening him. But to understand why that calm was so dangerous, you need to know what the studio believed about Marlon Brando and what they needed the world to believe. For years, Hollywood had been telling itself a story about Brando. That story wasn't about craft. It wasn't about what he did to acting, how he made it natural, how he made it bleed. The story was simpler, uglier, and more useful to executives. Marlon Brando is trouble. Trouble is a word studios love because it turns a human being into a line item. It turns dignity into attitude. It turns artistic standards into non-compliance. And once that label sticks, every negotiation becomes a punishment. By the time The Godfather came along, the industry had trained itself to see Brando not as an asset, but as a risk to be controlled. The studio wanted the prestige of his name without the inconvenience of his independence. They wanted the magic without the man. So when Brando accepted their conditions, the suits thought they'd won. But Brando wasn't surrendering. He was collecting information, learning the rules so he could bend them without being caught. And now, back on that set, with the boss standing in front of him, the real test arrived. Would Brando confirm the legend of trouble, or would he rewrite the legend in front of everyone? Brando looked at the man threatening him, then glanced just once toward the crew, not to seek support, to mark the moment, because Brando understood something. Humiliation is a performance too, and performances can be stolen. He kept his voice low, controlled, almost warm. He said, in effect, "You're afraid I'm going to hurt your picture. You're afraid I'm going to embarrass you." Then he did something that wasn't loud, but it was dominant. He invited the studio boss to stay, to watch. Right there, right now. No fight, no tantrum, no pleading, just confidence. The boss hesitated, because leaving would look like retreat, and staying meant risking something worse. Witnessing Brando do the job so well that the threat would look pointless. The cameras readied. The room settled into that sacred quiet. Brando shifted his posture a fraction. His face changed, not with makeup, but with intention. The gentleness became weight. The warmth became calculation. And then he played the scene, not like a star showing off, like a man who could end your life with a favor. Like an old king who didn't need a crown because the room already obeyed. The studio boss watched. Everyone watched. And the threat, this big, polished corporate threat, started to rot in real time, because the only thing that matters in that moment is truth. The camera doesn't care who owns the studio. The camera cares who owns the character. Brando held silences like weapons. He made stillness feel violent. He gave the room exactly what it didn't want. Proof that the film needed him more than he needed their approval. And this is the part that was kept quiet for years, because it flips the entire power dynamic. The studio came to intimidate him. Brando turned it into an audition for the boss. You want to judge me? Fine, sit down. Watch what you're trying to control. What would you have done in that moment if a powerful person tried to shame you in front of your peers? Would you fight back and risk everything? Or would you do what Brando did and let excellence do the violence? Comment below, I want to know. The take ended. No applause. Not on a set like that. But the air changed. People breathed differently, and the boss realized he hadn't just watched a scene. He'd watched a man take the threat and make it irrelevant. The studio boss tried to recover, tried to reclaim the ground he'd lost. He returned to the paperwork, the conditions, the warnings. Brando didn't argue the details. He accepted them. That was the genius. He gave the studio exactly what it demanded: discipline, punctuality, control, while quietly taking the one thing they could never own, the center of the film. He didn't defeat the boss by humiliating him. He defeated him by removing his reason to exist. Because once Brando proved he could be steady, the only thing left was fear. And fear looks pathetic when it's sitting across from real power. The boss left the set with his authority intact on paper, but in the room, among the crew, everyone understood the truth. The studio could threaten contracts. Brando could threaten history by making a performance so undeniable that no executive could rewrite it afterward. And in that moment, everything changed. Not just for the day, for the entire film. The immediate aftermath wasn't a shouting match. It was quieter than that. More humiliating for the studio because it looked like nothing happened. Brando went back to work, and here's the detail that matters. Once the threat failed, Brando didn't celebrate. He didn't act like a conqueror. He acted like a professional. Call times met, scenes delivered, a steady presence that starved the suits of the chaos they came to manage. That's how you know it wasn't luck. It was strategy. Because Brando understood the studio's weak spot. They didn't truly want war. They wanted compliance. They wanted predictability. He gave it to them just enough to keep them out of his way, while saving his real intensity for the camera, where their power couldn't reach. Now shift forward in time, because the film doesn't just become a hit. It becomes a cultural pillar. The kind of success that rewrites reputations and makes executives pretend they believed all along. That's when the second layer kicks in, the quiet cover-up. Hollywood doesn't like to admit when a suit got outplayed. Studios sell narratives the way they sell movies, and the narrative they needed was simple. This was a disciplined production. This was a controlled genius. This was a star who behaved. So the story of the threat faded, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was inconvenient. It made the studio look small. It made the boss look powerless. And it revealed something executives never want said out loud. Sometimes the artist wins, not by being loud, but by being undeniable. And Brando's public life after that didn't make the studio any more comfortable. He remained unpredictable in the ways that mattered, using his platform to challenge the industry's hypocrisy, refusing to play the gratitude game, making it impossible to turn him into a neat corporate trophy. Decades later, the real shape of those Godfather tensions became clearer through the people who lived it, through the accounts of the filmmakers, the producers, and the long trail of commentary that always follows a masterpiece. The Bond requirements, the studio resistance, the fear, the control tactics. It all points to one truth. Brando wasn't welcomed. He was managed. And yet he still walked away with the most important thing, the performance. Now here's the question, and I want your honest take. Was that studio threat just business, an insurance policy in human form? Or was it something darker, a deliberate attempt to break a man in front of his crew so the studio could feel powerful again? Which one makes more sense to you? Because if you've ever worked under someone who needed to remind you who's in charge, you recognize the feeling. It's not management. It's insecurity wearing a tie. And Brando's response, calm, surgical, genius, exposed it without ever naming it. That's why this story lived in the shadows. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too revealing about how Hollywood actually works when the lights aren't flattering. Brando's reaction tells you something important about who he was, and it isn't the tabloid version. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't easy. He carried contradictions like most brilliant people do, but in that moment on set, when a studio tried to shrink him with a threat, Brando did something rarer than rebellion. He chose control. Not control over other people, control over himself. He refused to give them the meltdown they expected. He refused to let humiliation write the story. He turned the confrontation into a demonstration, because he knew the only courtroom that matters in Hollywood is the screen. And on that screen, a studio boss has no power at all. That's the lesson. The suits can own the building, but they can't own truth once it's captured. They can threaten your job. They can poison your name. But they cannot edit out greatness when it's that heavy, that undeniable. And the legacy is simple. That performance didn't just save a film. It helped define an era where actors and directors fought for something raw again. Brando proved that discipline can be a weapon and silence can be a verdict. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If someone tried to break you in public, tried to make you small so they could feel big, what would you do? Would you swing back? Or would you let your work speak in a language they can't control? And tell us in the comments what you want next. Option A, the day Paul Newman refused a studio's dirty deal. Or Option B, the secret war between Hitchcock and his leading lady. Marlon Brando is gone, but this story needed to be told.